Just a brief intro to the book that we're publishing. The National Security Archive, with the help of the Wilson Center, is publishing a book by Sergo Mikoyan, who is the son of Anastas Mikoyan, Deputy Prime Minister under Khrushchev, and Khrushchev's right hand, who was probably the most crucial actor, I would argue, in the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Sergo Mikoyan, who unfortunately died in March 2010, began donating documents to the National Security Archive from his father's personal archives. And the subject is very sensitive in Russia, so it took him almost 10 years to donate the documents. Most of these documents are still secret in the Russian archives, and last time we checked, we inquired, there is still a debate where exactly those documents are, in the Presidential Archive or in the Foreign Policy Archive, but he donated to us his entire personal archive, and these documents provide some new revelations on the Soviet perspective of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The book's title will be The Soviet Cuban Missile Crisis. Castro, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and Mikoyan, and the Missiles of November. So just to briefly outline the major findings when we learned from these documents, first of all, we learned a more nuanced understanding of the Soviet motivations. Why missiles? Why did the Soviets put missiles into Cuba? And based on all the available evidence that we had before, and especially the Mikoyan documents, it seems that the Soviets, the top political leadership at least, truly believed that Cuba needed to be defended from an American invasion that they considered to be imminent in 1962. Also, the other nuance of the deployment of the decision is that although Khrushchev believed very strongly in the need to defend Cuba, and that was the mission of the missiles, the Soviet military understood very well that deployment of missiles in Cuba would alter the balance of nuclear strategic forces between the United States and the Soviet Union substantially. And the Cubans saw a completely different side of the story. They came out of negotiations with the Soviets persuaded that the missiles in Cuba were necessary to strengthen the socialist camp. And they actually strongly denied the idea that Cuba needed to be defended. In fact, they did not want to get the missiles for defense of Cuba. But they felt if they could play a role in strengthening the socialist camp, that was a worthy goal, and that is why they accepted the missiles. So there are three motivations there, but it seems like the dominant motivation is still to defend Cuba. The second finding, the second revelation, and I think this is most interesting one, is that Cuba almost became a nuclear power, and I will talk a little bit more extensively about that. And the third lesson that we learned, or a third revelation, which I couldn't say is an actual revelation, people have been talking about it for a long time, and I completely agree with conclusions that Marty made in his research, that Cuba was a crucial actor in the Cuban Missile Crisis. That the story, the historiography of the Cuban Missile Crisis has been so American-centered that it seemed like the main decisions were made in the United States. And the most influential actors were Kennedy, ex-Com, and Khrushchev. And Castro was kind of there in the dark on the island, not playing any substantial role. Well, these new documents reveal how important and crucial Castro was, and in fact how close he came to obtaining those nuclear weapons to be transferred to the Cubans, which was the Soviet intention. So let me tell you very briefly the story of the tactical nuclear weapons and how Cuba almost became nuclear power. In the agreements in the letters between Kennedy and Khrushchev, we know that tactical nuclear weapons were never mentioned. There were some suspicions on the American side that tactical nuclear warheads could have been delivered in Cuba in September 1962, but there was no definite evidence. And so the US proceeded on the basis of the assumption that there were no nuclear warheads in Cuba at all and no tactical nuclear weapons. In fact, in September 1972, the Soviets delivered bombs for Il-28s. They delivered cruise missiles and warheads, nuclear warheads for front cruise missiles, FKRs, and also nuclear warheads for Luna launchers, which were dual-use launchers. There was a debate in the Soviet Union about the pre-delegation of authority to use tactical nuclear weapons. And the initial story that came out at the conference in Havana in 1992, that the Soviet military did receive that pre-delegation. I think by now it is clear that this was an exaggeration. This was something that the Soviet military really wanted, but that the top leadership never agreed. But still, there was this debate. The second development in the story of tactical nuclear weapons is that on October 22nd, the Soviets were afraid or even anticipating an immediate US landing in Cuba. And the Presidium discussed what the Soviet response should be. And the response argued by Khrushchev, he argued that the response should be that tactical weapons should be the first weapons to use against the incoming force, and then the decision should be made about whether to use the R-12s and R-14s, the intermediate nuclear weapons. And then the decision was also made that after the training of the Cuban specialists by the Soviet specialists, gradually the tactical nuclear weapons would be transferred to the Cubans. And that was one of the parts of the agreement, military agreement between the Cubans and the Soviets that was never signed as a result of the crisis. So when the preliminary resolution of the crisis was reached in the letters between Kennedy and Khrushchev, Anastas Mikoyan was sent to Cuba to persuade the Cubans, who before that were not even informed, were not engaged in negotiations at all. Anastas Mikoyan was sent to Cuba to console the Cubans, persuade them to agree to the removal of the strategic weapons, but he also was acting on the assumption, which was the basic agreement, that the rest of the weapons will stay in Cuba. In fact, on November 6th, he pledged to Castro. He said, and you know that not only in these letters between Khrushchev and Kennedy, but today as well, we hold to the position that you keep all the weapons with the exception of the offensive weapons and associated service personnel, which were promised to be withdrawn in Khrushchev's letter. It takes Mikoyan 3 weeks on the island to gradually move from that position that the Cubans should receive these weapons, the tactical nuclear weapons, after the Soviet specialists trained the Cubans to use them. And then the Soviet specialists would be withdrawn and the tactical nuclear weapons would become part of the Cuban armed forces, so that the Soviets could not be accused of maintaining a military base in Cuba. He moves away from that initial Soviet position and in fact persuades the Soviet top leadership that these weapons should be removed, because he observes the Cuban often reckless and impulsive behavior. And he also realizes along the way that the Soviet Union, the Soviet leadership, really was not in control of the Cuban leadership. And that leads him to the conclusion that it would be too dangerous to leave tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba. Finally, by November 22nd, and I'm skipping a lot of important turning points, but if you're interested, I can talk about it more. The late night, midnight of November 22nd, Mikoyan, right before going into meeting with Castro and the top Cuban leadership, he sends kind of final telegram to Moscow saying, unless I receive any new instructions from you, I am just going to tell the Cuban leadership that we're removing all the tactical weapons. So he does, and there is this dramatic conversation where Castro basically begs Mikoyan to leave these weapons in Cuba. And his point is, look, nobody knows about them. They're not part of the agreement. You've made all these concessions to the Americans. Please leave these weapons here. They are our only hope for deterrence against an American invasion. And Mikoyan tells him, no, we're not removing these weapons because the Americans pressured us. It's our own decision. We're removing it on our own will. And then Castro tries to persuade him this way and that, and Mikoyan cites a law that actually does not exist in the Soviet Union. He says, look, we can't really transfer them to you because we have a law in the Soviet Union that specifically forbids the transfer of these weapons, even though that was part of the initial agreement. So that is when the real Cuban Missile Crisis, I think, is resolved, because that is the turning point after which Cuba cannot become a nuclear power. Now, a big what if is, what if the Soviets actually did not send Mikoyan? Well, probably the tactical nuclear weapons would have stayed in Cuba. The next what if the tactical nuclear weapons would stay in Cuba? I would say, and again, this is from these documents that we received from Mikoyan, it seems from his conversations on the island that Cuba was becoming a real active revolutionary promoter in Central America, in Latin America, and we know later in Africa too. And Mikoyan learns from the conversations that he has with Che Guevara, with Arbenz, with Fortuny, the leaders of Guatemala who are in exile now in Cuba, that Cubans are on the verge, on the cusp of this true revolutionary promotion in Latin America. Well, if they became a nuclear power and therefore they were not as afraid of US pressure, maybe we could hypothesize that their role in revolutionary promotion in Latin America would be more active and more assertive, which the Soviets, as we know, were very wary about and did not approve. And this is the last big lesson that we learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that the agency that we kind of forget to grant to the Cubans was actually a crucial agency, not only in the nuclear negotiations, but also in Latin America as this source of inspiration, as not just inspiration, but active promotion. We see it in the documents, for example, in conversation between Mikoyan and Arbenz. Arbenz, former president of Guatemala, complains to Mikoyan that the Cubans are trying to promote armed insurrection in Latin America. We send them our students to study at Havana University for education, and they turn them into guerrillas, and they actually instruct them in armed subversive activities and send them back to Guatemala, and they do it in other countries too. And Mikoyan has to explain to them that this is not a Soviet position. In fact, the Soviets are against export of revolution. So this is just one episode, but there are lots of them in these new documents that we got, which gives us a better understanding not only of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also of the relationship between the superpower and its clients. Where Cuba specifically was not an instrument of the Soviet power. Cuba, in fact, represented a perfect example of where the tail was wagging the dog quite successfully. And I guess the conclusion that I would like to make is, as Marty said, irrational luck was always an explanation to the puzzles that we're trying to explain, but also to really understand what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we should step away from looking just at the conversation between the United States and the Soviet Union and kind of the eye-to-eye and one-side blinked metaphor, but look more widely at the region and maybe at the world.